Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to this first in a series of podcasts focused on all things relating to knotty issues around partners, particularly whether they are underperforming partners, whether they are squabbling partners, or whether they are derailing the business. Um, and we have some wonderful podcast contributors here today. Absolutely delighted to have our friends from Edge International. We have Nick Jarrett-Kerr, who is a leading advisor to law firms on all things strategy, governance, and leadership. Nick, it's fabulous to have you here today.
Thank you.
And Jonathan Middleburgh, again, an advisor to law firms, particularly around the people aspects, kind of people and coaching and people management, performance management. And together they are the editors and contributors to a wonderful new book called Managing Partner Performance. Clues on the title of the podcast. Um, Strategies for Transforming Underperforming Partners. And I really would commend anyone watching this podcast or listening to it to take a look. You've got some really incredible global market leading contributors to various chapters covering all sorts of things about contribution, expectations, burnout, inclusion, process, etc. I mean, it really is a fabulous offering. So I would definitely recommend it. And thank you so much for joining us for this discussion about managing partner performance. We also have my brilliant partner, Corinne Staves, who I'm just going to say is, at least in my view, the best partnership lawyer in the UK. There is pretty much nothing that she doesn't know about partnership constitutions, structuring, mergers, and importantly today, partner performance. So my name is Clare Murray. I'm managing partner of CM Murray. We are a specialist partnership, employment and SRA regulatory firm, and we are delighted to bring this podcast to you. This is in the first edition of this series, is called The One with the Underperforming Law Firm. And we're going to jump straight in. So, Jonathan, together, you, Nick, and Edge have undertaken regular surveys and a recent survey on partner performance and contribution. And can you just tell us about the results of your most recent survey into partner performance? Kind of, what were the trends? Were there some sort of surprising things that jumped out at you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's wonderful to be with you, and both Nick and I are very excited to join you. Um, yeah, we've Nick's done a couple of these surveys previously. We ran another survey this past year, and there were some surprising trends and some maybe less surprising. I think, one that leapt out was that actually around a quarter of firms said that underperformance doesn't really have a significant adverse impact on profits. That really surprised me, certainly. Um, Maybe less surprising that about 40% say that has about a 5% adverse impact on profits. But somewhat surprising, I think, that so many are saying, look, we've got underperformers, but it's not really impacting on the bottom line. I think also surprising was that there are still a lot of firms saying they don't actually have robust performance management systems. Only around a quarter of firms actually say we have got a clear process and we've got a clear timetable for dealing with underperformance. And I'm sure we'll come back to that in the conversation.
Mm.
Unsurprising, I think that most say that they're focused largely on the bottom line financial issues and maybe somewhat less so on other criteria. Although a lot are measuring things like BD and originations and CRM and so on. I think just one other thing that I'll say I found surprising was that a lot of the firms seem to be giving significant support to underperformers. I think around three-quarters of firms said that they provide mentoring and coaching and counselling and other support to underperformers. And I certainly found that slightly surprising. It doesn't always chime with my experience of the law firms that I deal with. I think those are the three or four headline points that I would pull out, but lots of other stuff in the survey, lots of other interesting stuff.
Some really interesting things coming out of that. I mean, I guess my two initial questions would be, do you think that 25% who are saying that underperformance isn't affecting the bottom line, that that's their experience because they have other partners who are so overperforming that it's kind of all balancing itself out, and culturally they can accommodate as well as financially? I just wondered, and that does seem like a surprising statistic.
Yeah, I think it could be that. Certainly, the firms that I deal with, it's very typical to have a few either rainmakers or stars who are pulling a lot of the work and actually are very high billers. And there's often quite a degree of tolerance actually for what I would think of as underperformance. I'm sometimes surprised at how tolerant partners are of underperformers. I also wonder, and I don't know whether Nick has any thoughts about this, that I think it's possible there's a bit of underreporting here. I mean, when it comes to things like incidents of dependency on drugs and alcohol and so on, the figures given are really low. And I'm wondering whether that's kind of either wishful thinking or slightly, although all the results are obviously anonymized, whether there was an aspect of not wanting to air dirty linen in dirty laundry in public. Just a couple of thoughts.
Possibly. And my other quick point coming out of it was the remedial and supportive action.
Mm.
What's your experience of where firms are doing that, what they find helpful, what they particularly find helpful, and what has helped partners to turn around in practice?
Well, my experience is that it's generally two things. It's mentoring from senior leadership, and it's really sort of, senior leaders actually taking the time to sit with their colleagues and nurture them and reassure them. And a lot of partners do at some point either plateau in their progression or sometimes crater a bit and experience real difficulties. And the firms where it works out, it's where either a senior partner or a head of or a senior colleague has really taken the time and trouble to help the person and to give them confidence and reaffirm them. And then I think the external coaching properly targeted, and I'd emphasize the targeting. I'm not a fan of kind of sheep dip coaching. I don't think that is generally very helpful, but I think targeted coaching and support, particularly, my experience is where I've been working with a couple of firms recently where you're sort of tag teaming a bit between the external coach, either the line manager or key mentor, and somebody from HR who's also on it, and that really can be very impactful.
So, Nick, just sort of taking a step back here, do you think is it the firm that underperforms, or is it the individual partners that underperform? Or let me whisper this for a moment, between the four of us, is it possibly senior management that is underperforming by actually not setting direction, monitoring, and grasping the nettle effectively enough?
I think it's obviously to some extent a mixture, but I do think that senior management has got a lot to answer from. I mean, in the first place, I'm not sure firms have really clarified the expectations of partners. I always likened it to a speed limit. If you have no speed limit and someone says you're driving too fast, someone says, well, how do you know? But if you've got a speed limit of 30 miles an hour, it's easy to say who's breaking it, who isn't. And so many firms maybe have financial targets, but little else, and they seem to live by those. And I sometimes wonder whether people are managed properly. When firms are doing very well and profits are increasing, it's easy for someone who is slightly falling behind to hide their relatively small underperformance. the firm doesn't really notice it because profits are going up by 5, 10, 15%, and they just get on and think, we're doing well, we're doing fine, let's keep going. And I've seen this time and time again, that the underperformer gets, so to speak, overlooked. And I think it's the lack of clarity sometimes about expectations and the failure to manage people, if you like, on an individual basis. And we all know of firms where the partner appraisal system is just hopeless, and people just pay token presence to it. They cancel meetings or they don't attend them, and so on and so forth. And it's all sort of thing. Well, I can get away with blue murder here. Nobody cares. And after all, at the end of the day, I'm a partner, and who can kick me out? So all that comes into the picture, and if you like, it does come from the top.
And can I just ask you a question about the data? So being data led, to what extent do you think firms are sufficiently matching, even if they've got reasonably clear expectations, to what extent are they actually gathering enough data from different sources, including, and then being able to match it up? How good are they at that sort of
Yeah,
data-led performance management?
I mean, some obviously are great, um, but others, it's all they can do to collect the time recording and the billables and so on, and the financial data, let alone anything else. Very few firms seem to be able to hold partners to account for poor treatment of their trainees, or failure to guide young associates. They just get on and do stuff, and time again, there is no data. There's a lot driven by anecdote within a firm, and that's so harmful because whispers go around that somebody's doing good or somebody's doing bad, and it needs some metrics behind it. And of course, it's difficult. It's difficult with things like training and mentoring and the sort of softer areas of management to be able to come up with firm metrics that people can stick to, can rely on.
And so let me ask you this question. If you're looking at a firm, who do you think is in the best position to take the lead on assessing partner performance against expectations and then acting on it? So is it the managing, should it be the managing partner who's across sort of 150 different things all at once? Should it be HR having a stronger place at the table? Some firms they do, sometimes they don't. Or should there be almost like a designated member of senior management who their only focus is assessing partner performance, measuring it, monitoring it, managing it, and putting people through process? I'm just interested in an ideal world, who should take the lead on that?
I think you, in some ways, you've got to work from the bottom up as well as the top down. So, team leaders, department heads all have a big place in knowing how their people are doing. I'm a great believer in the old adage that people are best managed one at a time, and that needs somebody looking at each person at some level. Now, obviously, the managing partner can't necessarily do that, although I see too many managing partners sitting in their bunker and not actually walking around the offices and finding out what's going on. And so they have a role. If you've got a really decent financial head, CFO or whatever, they can tell a lot just that I can't see from the numbers. I mean, obviously, you can see who's not putting in the time, who's not realizing the time that's been put in, and there's a story. I mean, if you've got someone with loads of billable time on the clock and it's not being billed, what's going on there? And they should be coming to management fairly early and saying there's something going on here. They may not know what, but there's something going on here, and it needs some action. Maybe starting off with the practice head and moving upwards.
It's like early curiosity and potential
Yeah.
intervention, and actually asking the questions, because they could be very good reasons, kind of health reasons, things going on in someone's life, their practice focus just not being the flavor of the month this year. And I think having those early discussions are really, really important, and just someone being designated, like it's your job to be the curious person and start
Yeah.
raising these with senior management. Thank you for that. So Corinne, I know you've been sort of, right on the front line of some of these matters. What, in your experience, are the sort of the key risks for firms, and I guess also for partners, around poor performance, poor contribution, and failure to deal with it effectively?
Thanks, Claire. Well, I was going to start off by saying that the elephant in the room was the commercial risk, the financial risk around having underperforming partners and that having an impact on the turnover and therefore profitability. But Jonathan's completely contradicted that by sharing the data with us about the extent to which it does affect the top line and therefore the bottom line. I think that's probably true in a number of firms. I do wonder whether, particularly in the UK domestic market, whether firms are finding it harder and harder to deliver sort of year-on-year growth because costs are remaining stubbornly high. We're looking at sort of higher interest rates. Inflation has had a huge impact. So sort of delivering that year-on-year is getting harder and harder. So that performance might have been forgiven in prior years. And I wondered if you asked the same question in a couple of years' time, whether you would see the same data again, because I do think that there is that undercurrent that somebody is having to carry those people who aren't quite hitting what they're supposed to get into the pot. I'm not talking about extreme underperformance, but that sort of just everybody's sort of contribution to the pot so that it's fair. And I think that if we follow that through, when we think about the wider risks of underperformance and under-contribution, actually it comes down to this question of fairness and perceptions of fairness and how that affects the culture of the firm, how it affects really, really critical issues, which have financial implications as well. For example, recruitment and retention. If the really strong performers, the really strong contributors say, well, hang on a minute, there's someone who's consistently underperforming, not necessarily awful, but just not quite hitting it every time, and nobody seems to be picking up on this or requiring that they step up and fix that, then eventually they will become jaded, potentially, and think about what opportunity there is elsewhere. And let's be frank, there is plenty of opportunity out there for really strong partners. There are always people interested in really strong performers. So I think there's those wider risks that follow from not managing underperformance in the firm. I think it can also, even if it doesn't trigger something as extreme as exits and that sort of recruitment and retention point, I think it can affect the culture of the firm, which can be really quite pervasive. That sort of undercurrent of resentment or division can mean that when things get tricky or there are issues to deal with, management really struggle because they haven't got a collegiate body of partners that really believe in the firm's kind of mission and strategy. There's that sort of undercurrent of unhappiness, which I think can be really quite damaging. Clearly, if we're talking about risk here, in extremis, those issues can build into something really quite toxic. I mean, we all know of historic examples of where you have, say, a run for the door of partners and the firm implodes, for example. Now, that's a very rare occurrence, gladly, and but that is what we're worried about here. You know, it is quite a fragile mix, and if it gets upset enough, then there's other sorts of risks we really need to keep on the radar, albeit high impact, but hopefully low likelihood. I would also mention in the sort of risks pot, regulatory risks, because if you are underperforming, if you're under contributing, hopefully somebody's highlighted it to you, and it's an issue that's on the radar. And that can be a source of stress. That can be a real issue for the individual partner or partners that have to sort of step up if they think there might be consequences, which there should be, frankly. But that could be a source of stress. People who are under pressure, who are stressed, who are, have limited options, often make poor decisions, often exercise poor judgment. And that can translate into poor regulatory outcomes. For example, they make bad decisions about client take-on, they might make bad decisions about how they manage their team, about how they interact with other people within the firm, outside the firm. We've talked already about substance abuse, for example. Gladly, that's a very small number of people who react in that way. But there are a whole suite of regulatory risks which can be associated with underperformance in the partner body and across the firm.
There's such brilliant points. Thank you. I wonder if, Jonathan and Nick, I can just pull out one particular group of potential underperformance that you flag in your book, which is lateral hire partners. So you might have, the partners who are maybe sort of below expectations, but they've been with you for how many years, and frankly, they're your friends, and you know how they contribute in other ways, in very meaningful ways. But then you have the new partners that you've brought in with the big business plan and the big guesstimates of what their practice would look like. And we see so many of those coming in and failing, but maybe failing not fast enough, or the firm not addressing them quickly enough. And I just wonder if you've got any particular thoughts or experiences on for firms who are in that situation where they're bringing in new people, kind of who are sort of, bright and shiny, and then how you should actually be scrutinizing how they're doing and starting to actively manage early at what they're delivering.
The survey results were interesting because actually there was less report of failure of laterals than some other surveys. But broad experience suggests that it's roughly a third to a half of lateral hires that fail. It's a huge number and it's a huge cost, both the direct costs and all the opportunity costs. To my mind, many firms still don't take the integration piece seriously enough. So to your point, Claire, I don't think they are managing early enough and proactively enough. It takes a lot to make a lateral hire work. I think you've got to be on it right from day one. You need to have a sort of 100-day integration, if not plan, at least a focus on integration. That needs to involve properly introducing people and getting people working together. It needs to involve just practical things like, if there are contacts that we can leverage, having early discussions with those people so that the new lateral is brought in and introduced to the relevant clients and so on. I think it needs somebody who is close to the lateral and is kind of helping them understand and integrate to the culture, because that is difficult. My experience is that even people who are very senior and who are otherwise quite confident, that confidence can be surprisingly fragile. It's disorientating. It's like moving house, moving firm. It's a big deal. You're suddenly thrown in with a completely different set of people. The culture of your prior firm might have been very different, and you're suddenly trying to navigate all these different things and kind of read the runes of the culture. And there's no substitute for having one or two friendly people just on your side and wanting to make it work.
Nick, what are your thoughts on this, the lateral partner topic and performance managing them?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of it. I mean, I've been involved in lateral hiring for quite a number of years now, and an early failure was a partner who came in with a wholly unrealistic business plan. The benefit of hindsight, you could see it. He said he was going to bring X clients and Y bound to business, and it just didn't happen. And we're still seeing that a lot. People coming to a firm with an unrealistic plan. And so what we instituted, this is when I was a managing partner, which is a long time ago now, what we instituted then was an expectation that every lateral hire would complete a personal business plan. And I'm only telling this story because of the knock-on, which was that from there, we were able to persuade every partner in the firm also to do one. Because why should it be lateral hires, just lateral hires who do one? And so we then had a process by which every partner filled out a personal business plan, which was then checked for reality, monitored, managed against, etc., etc. Now, it's only a small thing, and that doesn't get you round the jerk who comes into the firm and they've been a jerk somewhere else and they're going to be a jerk wherever they are. It doesn't get you around that. Maybe you can see that at interview, I don't know, but that's one step that I've seen work quite well. And I think what it brings me on to in general is how you learn from your mistakes. And, Corinne was mentioning risk, and I can think of a number of occasions. I had one partner when I was managing partner who told a client that they had a court date when they didn't. And the client actually turned up at court, and there was nobody there because the partner had forgotten to rectify it. He thought he was going to say, oh, it had been adjourned or whatever. And we were able, therefore, to get rid of that partner in the circumstances where otherwise our partnership agreement had a virtual veto. And from there, we were able to change the partnership agreement very substantially to have a sensible voting structure. So you've got to learn from your mistakes. And every time a firm makes a mistake over a lateral hire or an underperforming partner, they ought to be sitting there thinking, what do we learn from this? What can we change? What can we do that's different from what we've done last time?
And maybe just add to Nick's point about the business plans. I'm sometimes quite shocked how often in smaller firms, I'm talking firms of sort of under 20 partners, maybe under 15 partners, nobody has business plans. I mean, even sort of, one-page business plans. They very often don't even know what their sort of turnover is, let alone how profitable they are. Yeah, sometimes that's a deficit of the management information, but often it is just as basic as them not sitting down once a year and trying to write a bit of a business plan. Doesn't have to be a long, complicated document, but something that is setting some expectations. And in a sense, it's equally shocking to your earlier point that somebody more senior isn't saying to them, look, you've got to have some sort of plan that we can hold you accountable to or measure you against or for your own motivation.
Yeah, motivation, exactly, and focus and being able to prioritize in a world of things that have so many calls on your time. Just actually knowing what are the top 3 things you should be delivering on in the next 100 days or something like that. So Corinne, so Nick's talked about learning from your mistakes, which actually makes for a much, I'd rather be in a firm that's actually had mistakes and has learned from them and sort of, developed new policies and practices. But you're very much sort of forward looking as well. So when you're doing constitutional reviews, and you are, at least in my mind, you're the queen of, LP constitutions. What are the sort of things that you would be not just looking backwards from mistakes, but anticipating? What are what's the essence within a constitution that kind of gives firms and senior management the tools that they need to address partner underperformance and help to turn it around?
Thanks, Claire. Well, first off, I think Queen of Constitutional Reviews. I think if I'd been casting ahead as a teenager thinking, what am I aiming for? That would absolutely have been the top label I've been seeing in my sort of quest for domination.
Should it be monarch? Should it be less gendered? Should it be the monarch of constitutional?
I'm happy with those pronouns. We're good.
Okay.
But if you'd all address me as Queen Corinne from now on, that would be great. Thank you. In terms of what tools we need, I think there's a mix there, really. We need carrots and we need sticks. Not carrot sticks, they're boring. Sticks, let's start with sticks so we can move on to the positive afterwards. I think it's really important that you do have a number of powers to protect the business. And Nick's example there was a really good one, that you need them just in case. Hopefully you won't need to use them, but you need them just in case. And the sorts of sticks, the powers we're talking about here is kind of the powers to impose performance management, first of all, sort of in a positive sort of appraisal sort of system to have those systems and processes, but also if issues have been identified, you need those powers to be able to say, right, well, we are putting you in a process. Here is our policy around performance management. These are the steps. This is the support, so that then you can work through that process. And at the end of it, you can stand back and say, was that a success? Yes, no. Was it not a success? Okay, what's next? Because one of the really difficult things that we deal with when we're dealing with things like partner exits is the firm maybe might come to us and say, this person, we really like them, they've been with the firm for a long time, but they just haven't quite cut it for a number of years now, and it's just sadly time for us to sort of part company and find a way to part company. And you say, okay, I'm sorry to hear that, let's see the appraisal data from the last 5 years so you can sort of demonstrate this sort of reduced contribution, the inability to meet up to the objectives that have been set. And then the firm will say, oh, I didn't write anything down, because they were so kind of worried about managing people's emotions and the sensitivities around sort of those sorts of aspects, that there isn't this helpful demonstration of the process that has been through. So then, of course, whether or not it comes as a surprise to that partner will say, well, I had no idea. Now I'd like 3 years to fix that. Whereas the firm is saying, well, actually, you've had your 3 years to fix that. They're not trying to be mean here. It's just human nature. So I think those powers are really helpful. And the consistent application of them is obviously important. I think you need some other sort of big sticks, frankly, things like powers to reduce compensation, powers to de-equitize people, powers to be able to take people out of the partnership, because it's no good saying you're underperforming if the partner can just cross their arms and say, well, do something about it then. You rarely find partners who are that bullish, but there are one or two out there, and they tend to be the most toxic ones. And then I'm afraid in extremis, you need powers to be able to remove without cause, because I don't think any firm would consider underperformance an expulsion sort of threshold event. There is a reason, of course, we're not talking about there being no reason here, but you don't want to say you are bad, you are leaving immediately and without notice. Nick's example was a very extreme one. That's an integrity and honesty point, which is enough to justify expulsion. Normally, it's not as egregious as that. So I think that's your suite of sort of policies and powers within the Constitution that you need. But you also need a number of carrots as well. You need a robust performance management system that recognises and rewards positive contribution. Obviously, we're talking about strong financial contribution, but everything else, people who nurture the team, people who develop the team, people who devote time to know-how, to BD, to sharing contacts, and those sorts of things. You also need to make sure that system is fairly applied and is seen as being fairly applied, because everybody trusts in the system. They accept that occasionally it's going to get it wrong, but generally the right result is produced, and that's really healthy for the culture and for the partner body as a whole. I think you need sort of very specific powers about being able to reward through the compensation system one way or another, or through promotions for people to be able to see that their positive behaviours are being rewarded. And you need to tie that in with your strategy and your objectives. So if, for example, things like loyalty are important to you, then your compensation system, and we're not talking about a compensation system, that's a huge topic, but your compensation system can't be year on year. You can't be up here one year and down here another. You have to have, say, a lockstep that says you've been with us 10 years, and that's recorded and rewarded in a certain way, if that's what you want. Maybe that's not what the firm wants, but that's the thing. You need to understand what your firm wants and needs strategically. And also it depends on the partner, the group, and what that person is trying to do. And succession is an area that we really struggle with, and lots of firms struggle with, understandably. So, for example, if you're saying, well, actually, we want to promote positive succession behaviours, then actually you need a system that says, right, well, actually, you should have no billings in your final year. You should see that drop off a cliff because you've handed over those relationships, you've handed over those clients. And the KPIs and the system needs to be sophisticated enough to actually sort of walk the walk if you're going to talk that talk.
I do agree with that, but if you're encouraging those behaviours, you need to. So if you're with, say, for example, you're encouraging older partners to be good citizens, and they're handing over their practice and their contacts, and then they're on the wrong end of a kind of a partner poor performance concern. There needs to, they do need to join up. If you want me to do that, well, you have to protect me as a partner, which then brings us on, and I'm going to address this to Nick first, if I may, kind of what role you think leadership and culture overall kind of plays in firm and partner performance.
I mean, they obviously overlap greatly. Because the leadership wants to promote the right culture that in turn promotes the behaviours that the firm wants to in order to achieve its strategy. So if you've got a firm that's a very young firm going for growth and so on, the strategy for that may be slightly different. The behaviours you need might be slightly different from a firm that is, trying to maintain a group of existing established clients that they just want to keep happy. So it varies a lot. And as far as culture is concerned, obviously, one of the issues that I think I've learned is you can't actually lead culture. That you can influence it, and it's up to the leadership team to have a very heavy influence on the sort of firm you are, whether you want to have a light hand type of firm, as Stephen Mason would have called it, or a light touch, or a heavy touch. Some firms are very heavily managed, some firms are lighter touch, almost like a club, and that will vary from firm to firm. But the leadership needs to understand the sort of firm that they are, their identity, their purpose, their strategy, and how they're going to promote a way of doing things in the firm that will make for a happy place, that will retain and encourage people, will motivate people, and all those good things. And so, yeah, it is a big leadership task.
It's so interesting. I can think of a very well-respected US law firm managing partner where he is very clear when he speaks that theirs is a light touch firm, and that's part of their selling point, to firms coming in, to potential partners coming in. So it's really interesting to hear you sort of articulate that. Jonathan, any thoughts from you on sort of the importance of culture in terms of performance and performance management?
I think culture is really important. It's kind of the soil that kind of nourishes the partners. But ultimately, I think good behaviours cascade from the top. They always do. So leaders set the tone from managing partner downwards. And I agree totally with Nick that leaders can only influence culture, but they can absolutely influence good behaviours. So, every aspect from giving of clear, crisp feedback to running a good performance management process to walking the floor and kind of being engaged with people. Every single aspect in firms where they have brilliant leaders, you very often find that cascades downwards. And correspondingly, where you have somebody who's kind of disengaged and there's a big difference between conscious light touch and just being absent. And in firms where the managing partner is sort of absent or just engaged in the technical detail, but not actually managing people, you notice that in the way that others manage performance of people who are more junior to them.
I would add to that. I would completely agree with all of that, but I would add to it as well that sort of leadership piece is really important to the consistency of decisions, which feeds directly into fairness, and that's the management team, of course, but there are the wider sort of organs within the organisation. For example, REMCOM. That's a really, if the firm has a sort of remuneration committee or decision makers in that space, that's another great example of how that sort of leadership, that consistency, that culture needs to shine to create fairness in the process. And I think that there's stuff that sits behind that. For example, decisions around how those people are elected, how regularly they are sort of rotated, term limits, opportunities to remove those sorts of checks and balances. Again, in a healthy firm, hopefully you'll never really need to think about them. They just work, but you notice their lack in less healthy firms.
Thank you. I mean, for me, I sort of pick up on a point that Nick mentioned earlier, or develop it, just the importance of curiosity. That, we are in a partnership, and even no matter how big the partnership gets, the fundamentals of it is that you are in a relationship with other individuals, even if it's within a corporatized entity. And it's the lessons of communication. I think they've been made more difficult with hybrid working, but it's kind of learning how to communicate with each other well and regularly and effectively, and to do it, and to remember as well that many of us started, and again, picking up on your original title, the one with the underperforming law firm, Jonathan, is that actually many of us originally started out as friends. And, it's kind of trying to retain that that sense of friendship between us as partners, no matter how big you get as a firm. I have really enjoyed this discussion. I hope you have too. Thank you so much for your very, very thoughtful contributions. And of course, if you've been watching this, I really hope you've enjoyed it. This, as I say, is the first in the series of podcasts around issues, knotty issues relating to partners. The next one is called The One with the Squabbling Partners, which will be familiar to many of us at various stages of our careers. Looking at things like, what happens when key partners aren't getting on, and they think it's just the two of them, but everybody knows and it's cascading out of control. What's the impact? What's the effect on the business? And then how do you try to reverse that inevitable impact? I know this, Jonathan, this is a big topic of yours, a big sort of area of focus of yours, as well as Nick. So I'm really looking forward to that with our partner, Zulon Begum. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please, as they say, like and subscribe and share it with your friends. And a final kind of shout out for Jonathan and Nick's excellent book on managing partner performance and strategies to deal with it. Really worth a look. And again, thank you so much, everyone. And speak to you soon. Thanks a lot. Take care.